Welcome to the second long time coming rural community food system model development group. That's what they seem to be. Most of, I think all of you that are here to this point have been engaged in this to some point, to some extent to this point. So it's not completely new. What I would like to add before we actually get started is that I hope you realize that when you see other people's models, you usually see them in a relatively completed state where they have worked on them, reworked on them, and overworked on them. And I hope that from the first session and from this session, you will realize that it's chaos in motion. Hold on, I got to turn off somebody's keyboard here. Okay, so because what you end up with is a model that typically makes sense to at least the developer. And the people that look at it after that miss the experience of all of the chaos that happens in the process of producing that model, because you put things in and you take things out and you rework the definitions and you know it looks like a mess for a long time until it finally begins to settle in terms of the dance between the developer and the model to coming to some level of concurrence in understanding. So we're going to do some more of that today. A couple of things that I would offer you is Ryan has managed to fix the issues so that if you click on an asterisk now, it will actually take you to the right issue thread associated with that particular issue, as opposed to back to wherever it used to be, which I thank him for tremendously. If for those of you who are registered to interact with this project, Brian, John, Franco, Bachara's not in here. If you want access to this project, send me an email with your Kumu username in it and I will give you access. But what will happen is if you go to this URL and open this, if people have made comments in various issues that you have not read, there will be a little gray box around this with a number on it telling you how many issue threads have posts in them that you have not seen. And if you then open the issue threads and go to the list of them, the ones that you haven't seen will be highlighted. And you can tell who's actually, oh, let me go back here. This little dots tell you who's actually made posts in that particular issue thread. Not that they're big enough to read, but okay. The other thing is, in terms of realizing that at some point in time, this has to be unfolded so other people can follow the story. When I built the template, I built in the template for doing partial views, which is this piece of code and these, so that this dots across the bottom, I went ahead and defined R1, R2, and R3 and set them up so that there's a tag for R1, there's a tag for R3, so that the dots across the bottom now work, at least for the first 3 loops, so that you see the loop itself, and when you mouse over it, it will show you a short brief for the definition of that loop. how all of this is done is actually not rocket science. There's a little field called brief, and in the coding for this, it does something called popovers, and it shows an image if there is one, and the variable brief when you mouse over it. So that's the way that that gets done. So initially, when I had done these, I displayed the whole description in popover, but it got to be too much. So what I realized was we might want to write extended descriptions in the field itself, but when you pop over it, you don't want to display all of that. So there's a brief field. This is what we're trying to understand, so that now once that is entered, if you mouse over that, that shows up as the brief. And you can do that on any field, I mean, any element or any connection in the model that you want to affix a little explanation to, something shorter than the overall extended description for that particular component. Comments to this point? Oh, I muted everybody, so you have to unmute your mic if you want to say something. Okay. Then the question is how to continue the evolution of the project, where R1 currently talks about local sustainable food system, community health, desire for local food and local production. You end up looking at that and you say, okay, is local consumption something that actually also directly influences this, or does local consumption influence local production, or does local production influence local consumption, or do they directly influence each other?
Gene, where do you put in the retail sector and actually local retail and wholesale? I mean, so for example, whether that's Walmart or Kroger or any of these Costco, their sourcing strategy at this point excludes local. There's no consideration in most cases to purchase local, which is the major bottleneck in the food system development. You have on the one hand farmers who are interested to get into regenerative organic. You have consumers who really want that product, but the middle supply chain is locked up. And that's not a policy decision by government. There's nothing government can per se do. That is really a strategic decision that companies like these retail conglomerates have to do, or and it implies a certain decentralization of their supply chain. Where do you, how do you see that expressed here?
Well, part of it might have to do with what is it that we actually mean by local sustainable food system. Is that actually, does that encompass, now take a single household, what they consume? Does local sustainable food system encompass what is grown locally and what is provided by the supermarket?
So there may be two aspects of regional. One is from a business perspective, you want to support your local community and you want to support local business. The other one is regenerative organic focus. That means that means a certain specialization based on local regional conditions of climate, topsoil, water, and socioeconomic conditions. So these will drive what is the most beneficial type of crop that can be raised within this climate zone and availability. So those are two different aspects. So local is not necessarily only supporting your local business, but it's creating the differentiation, and the current industrial agricultural system overpowers the differences in soil, water, climate by using chemicals and industrial processes. Does that make sense? So that this distinction, the differentiation between these two factors there?
Well, I mean, where it fits depends upon what it is that you're trying to understand. Okay, so that, as I said, if it is what, given a household in a community, there is more than one source for what they consume. And if you are simply interested in understanding where their food comes from, which really isn't local sustainable, it's I don't know. To me, local sustainable has to do with promoting local growth, local food growth, and to the extent that big box food suppliers, grocery stores, are willing to source locally, then you would add it to the mix from that perspective. I mean, I think what your question points out is that it's absolutely critical that you have a sense of what it is that you're trying to understand, and that helps you understand what's relevant as you synthesize the relationships, because if you can't have an absolute understanding of what it is you're trying to understand. Otherwise, you'd already understand it. You wouldn't need to build a model.
So Gene, I have a question. Wouldn't what was brought up by, I think it was Klaus, be reflected under the business pressures from large providers? Because I think your point is absolutely right. Is that production is what feeds the consumption, right? You were asking what the relationship between those are, and wouldn't sort of pressures by exactly. It's not a policy question. It's not a policy influence. It's a what are the businesses that are going to dictate whether it is local production, which would then feed into that means that's local sustainable food system, right? Because you can have consumption that's totally not sustainable, that's influenced by business practices of those providers. That's how I sort of see it in the diagram that you have shown here. But
so you could go ahead and say, if I do this, if I talk about retailers, and what I'm retailers willing to does that make sense? Local retailers willing to source local does in fact impact local consumption, but it would also influence local production. If they're willing to source locally, it would encourage people to produce locally.
And also local consumptions influence retailers willing to source. So if the retailers find out they are getting local consumption, won't they increase their willingness to sell?
If, well, local consumption for the, okay. Is this the relationship that you meant?
Because I think it has to go straight back to the retailers because they're the ones that are in the front lines.
Okay. All right. So back to the place that I started at, had to do with local consumption influencing the local sustainable food system directly, or is it the desire for local food which influences the production, which influences the local consumption? In other words, there's a reinforcing structure here. That's not part of it.
I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive. I think it's probably on a multi-level basis. And yes, desire for local food does influence local consumption. And yes, local consumption does influence local sustainable food system. It's both.
So what do you want me to draw?
I would say, okay, for myself, and this is my own view, is the desire for local food should go to local consumption, not to local production.
This.
That's right.
Okay.
It's more natural to me.
Okay. And then there's the local consumption that promotes local production?
No, I would still put it through the local sustainable food system because I think there's an interaction between the two. Because
okay,
what you mentioned before about households have a choice between where they source their food from. I mean, sometimes they don't even know where it's coming from, but they still have that choice. So they can do it either from the big retailers like Costco, or they can go down to their local farmers market. And that can move back and forth. The same thing is true of local production. The local production, the organic farmer, if he was able to, he would be shipping his products out to beyond the region. If he could make money off of it, and he had the right level of productive capacity. But there's going to be a mix between those two things. Or if he can't make enough money off of doing organic farming because he can't get beyond a certain market level, he's going to change over and do something else.
Okay.
So I think what you have here, it makes sense to me.
Okay. And then, though I can understand this, is there still this relationship that should be there? The desire for local food influences local. In other words, we need something that promotes local production, and it's currently not on the map.
Right, which is true. It's true. And I'm not sure it's actually desire for local food. I think it's something else. I'm not sure what it is. I don't have a problem with it being shown there, but I don't think it's that strong, at least not for me. But in one, I mean, if other people think it's there, let's keep it in there. We can.
Other thoughts?
So local food, there are two thoughts behind local food. One is you want to support your community. You want to support local businesses. The other one is you want to have regenerative organic food. And so that when you look at seasonality, for example, that may not always be available from where you live. So the retail sector has this function of moving food from one area to another as it becomes available. And that has gone bonkers because we now need strawberries in December, and so the availability of these these products has created a pressure on agriculture to do things that are not natural. So that's then causing a lot of distortions in the production process. Where we are, I represent Citizen Climate Lobby with Regeneration International. So Regeneration International is a nonprofit that is focused on regenerating soil and sequestration of carbon into soil. So we look at that, as a regenerative organic methods as the primary objective to adjust agriculture, and so that's what I was saying before. In order to go into regenerative organic, you have to get into regional production, because the soil requires different growing, different crops, different crop rotations, use of cover crops and so on, in order to regenerate itself. And so that priority is difficult to express here, if I'm making sense. So the priority is we need to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil, regenerate the soil. And so that means we have to respect regional and local conditions, weather, climate, soil, and then economics. And we have a wholesale retail sector that is completely unresponsive to any of those needs. But that is the dilemma that we are facing currently in the industry.
Klaus brings up a couple of thoughts for me, and one is, I think, at least for me, again, I want to make sure I'm not being overly biased here. Sustainable, we might be using the word sustainable in two different ways. One is ecologically sustainable, as Klaus is talking about with regenerative agriculture and so forth. We're also talking about economically sustainable. And everything Klaus has said about the pressures that, whether you're doing regenerative or not, you still have a very difficult time having to compete against factory farming and the large retailers and the supply chains that you have. But both the local farmers who aren't regenerative are just trying to be local, and those regenerative systems, which would be better, no doubt about it, face the same competitive pressures, the business pressures that somebody mentioned before, from large providers. And I think for this system is that we take a look at that, and then you can take a look and say, okay, because the regenerative processes are going to be even more non-competitive, to my mind, even have even more economic elasticity than just local providers. So if you have to solve the first problem of how do you make a system that makes it competitive for local or regenerative farmers to compete in our biased community system, our biased agricultural system. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, so what do I do with that?
I think right now we're on the right track, because what we're trying to do is figure out, and I think we may need to think a little bit more about those factory farming pressures and how local systems react against them. But I don't have any really changes to the map at this point. I guess.
Brian, are you moving back and forth, toward and away from the mic? I mean, I think I'm losing.
Okay, I'll try to stop doing that. Sorry about that.
Well, no, I'm sort of not clear at the moment as to. I mean, what you say seems to make sense, but I can't figure out quite what to do with it.
I think we need to find governing purposes, so a hierarchy of purpose for the local food system, and embed that into the larger system. So the overarching, when you listen into what's happening in the food world or in the food systems world right now, it's all about regenerative organic. It's about carbon sequestration into soil. It's about topsoil preservation, water management, because we have a total mess out there, where we have lost 1/3 of our topsoil in the last 40 years. So water into the food system really is at risk. And so that to repair that requires a regeneration of the soil.
But what you're talking about, Klaus, is not local sustainable. It's universal. I mean, has to do with not just the local production. It has to do with the large scale farms all over the country, all over the world. They're experiencing the same problems in terms of losing topsoil and not regenerating it.
Right.
So one thing, what I sort of see with the diagram as it stands, is there's a lot more that's feeding into what influences local production, which is, I think we can all agree about those driving the production. But I think the points that I'm hearing are related to what's driving local consumption, right? So whether it's a need to restore and I think these elements are there, right? Promoting community health, right? Some of the forces that impact the consumption are going to be related to that, just as you have, I think, more things showing influencing the production, right? So I think at least that's what I'm hearing, right, is what it's more than just policy that influences consumption, right? There's what we've already captured, the retail's willingness to source locally, but also, I think, as Klaus is pointing out, other motivations about improving the ecological health of a place by how you choose to consume, right? So, because whether you produce it locally, I'm thinking about areas where maybe the production has to be in support of one economy, right? So it's a very fertile farm area, but it's all dedicated to, let's say, dairy production, and therefore there's just lack of availability of some of those food options that might influence consumption, right? So if they're related, right? I think that gets back to your original point: is what's the relationship between production and consumption? Well, I think it's more complex, at least on the consumption side, than is what's currently captured, right? And so I think that's at least what I'm hearing the points. So I think, adding some of these forces that might push on the consumption, what's motivating people's consumption, right? It's not going to be just wanting to promote community health, right? It's going to be what can I afford? What's available? So, and there probably are more altruistic motivations, but it's also.
Uh-oh. What happened? Hello?
I'm still here.
Oh, okay. All of a sudden, whoever was talking, you stopped, and I thought I lost everything.
Yeah. That's all.
Is that what you meant? There are additional things that, in other words.
I think that answers at least a little bit with how I am interpreting Klaus's and Brian's comments are, what's going to motivate consumption? We had initially just the policy influences, right? And I think Klaus brought up, well, it's going to be more than that. It's going to be some of the ecological considerations as you have there, and and then brought up the retailers. Some retailers don't source local and won't source local. So I think,
right. And it's not. It's not a single perspective, because the purchasers are on a continuum, so that some people, from ecological considerations, will buy local. Some people will buy strictly based upon cost. Some people will buy, I'm missing the word. I don't know, but I mean, so that different people have um, different levels of driver that that causes them what to consider. In other words, on some days I'll go to the grocery store to buy tomatoes, and other days I'll drive 3 miles down the road to go to the stand where the guy sells local, and it depends. But you know, it's if local is sourced through the grocery store that I go to, it makes it more convenient.
I'm going to say that regardless of why people buy things, whether ecological or desire for particular food or whatever, it's still going to come down at some point in time to a matter of supply and demand. And so we need to have somewhere in there, at least behind the scenes, some consideration about supply and demand and whether or not how that affects things. I mean, I can look at it outside of this map, but I don't know how to put it in the map directly. I mean, I think we just assume it. But we need to recognize
that. So local production has an influence on all three of these, doesn't it?
yes.
Yeah, I sent you an article, the agriculture of the middle, Gene, and the gist of this is from EcoTrust. It's a local NGO in Oregon here, Oregon and Washington, and they have done an extensive study on what prevents farmers from shifting here, you know, and getting into the market here with a regenerative organic product. The problem really is that there is a farmer that is too big to sell into farmers markets and consumer and the consumer supported agriculture, and that they're too small to supply the retail chain, because the retailer, they order 500 acres of whatever, and they do that the year before the growing season starts. So those farmers are left out in the production process, and so they are forced to go into monocropping to accumulate enough volume to at least sell their crop to like one single retailer, and that is really where the hitch is. So even for larger farmers, they may have 2,000 acres. If they want to take 100 or 200 acres and start shifting regenerative organic, there is no market for them to get into, because the wholesale and retail sectors are unresponsive to that. They insist on their current way of supply chain management, which is highly centralized. So I don't know how to express that. But so the push for local then comes to support these farmers, what we call is called agriculture of the middle, to support these farmers to become to gain access to the market and achieve that through local demand.
Well, okay. So local consumption is the actual demand. The desire for local food isn't the demand. It's you you have to purchase it. You have to attempt to purchase. In other words, I can desire local food, but if I don't act on the desire, then it's just a desire. If I actually go and purchase local, then the demand is experienced by the provider. Correct?
You may not be able to act upon your desire for local food because the retailer doesn't carry it. And and the farmers market doesn't provide sufficient access to the consumer. So
Okay, though it's not realized, I would need to communicate that desire to. Okay, maybe that's why we actually have desire for local food influencing production and consumption.
well, I would argue that desire for local food has to influence the retailer. I mean, we're working on campaigns to have Kroger and Albertson and Walmart pushed, to source local, because you need to have a push-pull scenario where the farmer pushes and the consumer pulls.
So you're talking about this relationship.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to disagree. I'm going to say desire for local food can only be communicated to the retailers through local consumption. Somebody has to be buying products and enough that the retailers feel that this is a market we can expand upon.
So you
I would just leave it the way it was.
so you're saying that it goes from here to here to here.
This whole thing.
Yeah, right, which you've already got, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Consumption is how the consumer communicates to the retailer, right? So I think that I agree. I think the way it's set up now is captures that relationship.
So being the retailer being aware that people are consuming locally, they then become willing to actually source local to make it available.
Right, which I think therefore we need to capture the retailers willing to source local, impacting the availability. Right, so some of those elements, the ones that are outside that reinforcing loop, I feel the ecological considerations, product cost, availability, right, those are obviously all, or not obviously, but the availability is related to the retailer's willingness to source, right? That's influencing that, as well as product cost. The more product that's available probably will reduce the cost somewhat through competition.
So your comment was this influence?
The other way around.
But reversing, yeah, the retailer's willingness to source is going to influence the availability.
This way?
I'd say so.
And this one?
Yes.
The product cost isn't going to influence their willingness to source?
Actually, I'm thinking a loop here. I'm thinking availability. Okay, wait. Retailers' willingness influences availability. Availability influences product cost, and product cost influences willingness to source. I would say that is a loop. No, not that way. No, from availability to product cost. Yes.
So now you have a loop here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if I can sell the thing at a price that's going to make me some money as a retailer, I'm going to be willing to sell it. If I'm willing to source local, that means there'll be more availability. If there's more availability, that will lower the product cost. So I see a beneficial reinforcing loop there.
Stop. Okay. So where does this piece go?
Education's related to ecological considerations to some extent, right? That's how do you know it's good for the local ecology? Well, you learn that, right? And then when you know that, I think that increases your desire for local food, because you actually start to see the reinforcing relationship that motivates you, that maybe it's cost a little bit more, but it's going to benefit more in the long run, right?
And so then it also influences this.
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything else, anywhere else that education should influence directly?
What about community health?
Do I hear a second?
Makes sense.
In other words, an education to allow others to realize that sourcing local promotes community health from a couple of ways. It keeps the money in the community, and the food's better, usually. Okay.
What influences education? Because we don't have anything going into education.
Say it again.
What influences education? Because we don't have anything going in. I mean, you would think that if you got all this great information about health and ecology and so forth, there would be a greater emphasis on education.
I cannot hear you. Can you speak louder, please?
What influences education? We don't have anything going into education.
Right. And you gave me an indication of something that did.
I mean, you would assume that ecology and community health and so forth would feed back into education, but I don't really see that being done, because we'd have more of a reinforcing loop.
Well, so I would argue that local sustainable food system feeds into education, right? I mean, if it starts, well, or it could, right? It could, that starts to gain momentum, right? It's going to reinforce that it's actually going to promote community health. And there should be a reinforcing loop that feeds into people's motivation to learn more about it, right? And that might even be related somewhat to public awareness to some extent, right? Motivates your desire to want to learn more about how is this influencing my choices and the reinforcement of it. Yeah.
We got that. Where is it? Oh, we got one of those.
Right.
So maybe education can be broken down into education about personal health, because there's clear evidence that 80% of our healthcare problems are nutrition driven. It is environmental health, and it is community health in terms of business and local employment. If we can divide it into these groupings.
Okay.
There could be another aspect of this promotes community health thing, in that the community would respect and understand how food is grown and marketed and priced and all those sorts of things.
So is that all part of education?
Yes.
Well, I see it as the education could incorporate, which it currently does, the ecological considerations, but I think that was brought up earlier, the economic considerations, and that obviously feeds back into the production, right? So if there's and that gets to the push-pull comments that were made earlier, was that it can't just be, oh, well, this is going to help the local environment. It also has to help, sustain the local economy. So I think that it ties into both of them. And right now it's currently only driving the consumption, but I think it would also, and I guess it kind of does through the expectation of the consumer that then influences the production. that you have there. But I think it maybe is more direct, not through the ugly food movement, but through education influences economic and ecological consideration. That makes sense.
So you want a relationship from education to where?
To the expectation of consumers. That's what's gonna change your expectations, right? Is your awareness of.
You want me to move this one?
I think so. Because that's what's driving then back into the production, right? Which I think feels, in my mind at least, as a better potential reinforcement on those two things.
We're showing the output of education, but not the input.
Okay, let me ask a question on the education and expectations of consumer. More education does what to expectations of consumer? I mean, how does this work?
Well, I think if you're more aware of as was brought up, the benefit of not just the local ecology, but also the economic health of the local producers, I think the more aware you are of that, I think the more willing you are to therefore shop local, which then reinforces that behavior, right? At least that's how I see it. I think that education, your awareness is going to, which again, I think the public awareness is what's feeding currently into education, your desire to learn more about the way the local food is produced and how that will then influence the way you choose to consume as a result of that.
So we're really talking about the willingness of consumers to purchase local products.
When these two pieces were put in here,
Yeah.
it was started from the ugly food movement, which increasing the ugly food movement decreases the expectation of the customer in terms of what it is that they expect the food to be, which then increased local production, which was the way that it was thought about. So that this actually diminished the expectations in terms of if I buy stuff that comes from an industrial grower, I expect it to be perfect. Whereas if I buy organic, there are things, my expectations are different. I mean, that was all right. But there's also, you could look at expectations of the customer in terms of, yeah, but that's probably covered by desire for local food as opposed to,
What if you take education, expectation connection and move it to ugly food movement?
but take this connection,
Move it to ugly food movement.
which is where it was a minute ago.
Yeah, I think and then I think I see that now. Yeah, that it's their education is influencing the way you perceive what is satisfactory food, right? So I think you're right.
That's it.
Yeah.
But that education also increases the desire for local food, which is an expectation, but a different expectation.
And I would say we have that seasonable availability that should influence expectations as well, right? Because I think that was brought up, right? You can't get certain foods year round, right? And you need to that influences that's related to your education, right? When you're aware that that certain things grow better at certain times of year, that'll change your expectations of when you don't get it all the time.
You want this to go here, or you want it to go to education?
I think your education.
Hello?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think I think your education helps you understand the reality of seasonal availability, which then therefore influences the expectations. So I would bring it into that loop.
I still don't have it.
So I think the seasonal availability will influence the expectations.
Here.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I noticed that people are putting some relatively long comments in the chat, which is fine. I can't read them now, but they will be captured and they will be posted. So that once this session is done, when you go to this element, which I'll post the link to, in the notes section. This is one. This is two. So when we had the first session, there were a whole bunch of comments in the chat room, and they're all there, as well as the video for that particular session. That will also be true for this session. The content of the chat will be posted along with a link to the video. FYI. Well, Brian, what did you say?
Oh, what?
Something about the pathway is chaotic?
Oh, I was reacting to something somebody else said.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I can't keep up.
Yeah.
I know that.
So someone was just, John was just making a comment here on the supply capability and supply chain as the elephant in the room in the notes here. So the technical reality of the way that the food industry works is that a company like Kroger has to plan ahead. That means contracting typically before the crop goes into the ground. So that relationship really demands for Kroger to have the intentions of sourcing locally, and then in smaller quantities for multiple providers, because those are smaller farms, or they produce smaller quantities of certain crops. So that creates an aggregation problem. So the way that the industry has organized itself is to make it simple and easy, to order 1,000 acres of carrots or whatever, put it into a national central distribution system, and then ship it out from there. It's a complete idiocy how the system has structured itself, but it is highly efficient from an industrial engineering perspective. It just doesn't work for the natural systems.
Though while you say that, all of the grocery stores that I visit have locally sourced food in addition to the stuff that comes from big ag.
But
So you have Whole Foods. There are some, but Walmart certainly doesn't do it. Kroger doesn't do it. Even Trader Joe's doesn't do it. I mean, they may have regional centers, but you don't see. I don't see local sourcing.
Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
I like so much what we have done so far, but I wonder how we can include the history, because to get an insight, we should know why the local production shifted to global, let's say, and how we can include this in this insight. To get a real insight, we should know why, because 200 years ago, or it was all local, and then it shifted. This is one question. Another question is, I know, let's say in countries, sometimes the local producer, they need to go international. I have this in Lebanon. We have some grower, let's say, of some kind of food, and they don't survive if they sell locally because it's very cheap. So they need to go to survive. They need to go and sell internationally, and we help them to, like sesame, like some kind of you have Oregon, okay, and how we can include also this, because local producer also, we should know that they need also to go through the big system to survive, because if they sell locally, in general, they sell at a low price, and they cannot only survive by selling locally. I don't know if in the States it's the case, but in my country, to survive, they need to go in the big market, you know. Those two, I don't know how we can include them in this.
Well, depends upon where you want to start the story. Okay. Once upon a time, there were dinosaurs. It's,
Yes.
To go ahead and explain how the food system got to where it is today. I don't think that's a long story. You can lead it in by adding a few additional pieces, though.
I think what you referring to actually brings up a good point. There is no food system that will ever be completely local. We will always import certain grains. Fresh produce is likely to be local. Meats can be local, but there are some foods that are more efficiently produced elsewhere. So we will need to continue shipping, and particularly with foods that are shelf stable. So I'm not sure how that would be expressed here. How you separate into food categories that benefit from central production versus food production.
Well, when this model was initially started, the person who suggested local sustainable food system, I seem to recall that they talked about their definition of local sustainable took into account the fact that in any given region, only certain things can be local, and at different times of the year, they can only be local. I think there was a comment not too long ago about strawberries in December. They don't grow well in the snow. So if you want strawberries in December, you need to get them from somewhere else. And is that actually a sustainable practice?
So one thing I see it up in the corner, the shift value system. From in my mind, that's where it's at, right? Is that what you value or what you attribute value to is going to influence, as was brought up, the way that these suppliers are going to stock, right? I mean, Klaus, you're speaking to how it currently is. Well, and it was brought up just a second ago. Well, it's not always been that way, right? So, the value system, I think, has devolved into we want to pay as little for possible for food. That's going to then influence what you choose to eat, because we all need food to sustain our energy. But what type of food we use is influenced somewhat, I think, by value, which I think exactly is related to education, right? So, and I think that could potentially challenge the way these producers, the practices they follow, right? I mean, that's whether it's the value system, I think, is dictating the economic and the ecological motivations.
Right.
Yeah.
system is dictating the value system at the same time.
Right.
We're talking about here Danilo Metals, highest level of paradigm shift.
Right. So there are certain places, there are 30 years of demonstrated history that regenerative farming is actually less expensive than what most are doing today. I mean, some of the works that have been published are essentially undeniable, but some people still refuse to do it. Oh, that's the same reason that some people still refuse to stop smoking. You can't fix stupid, I guess.
Well, that's
I said you can't fix stupid.
No, but that's more complicated, Gene, because the monocropping methods require chemicals, and the industry has completely specialized around monocrops, because the entire supply chain has specialized. You wouldn't have McDonald's if it wasn't for Monsanto and Tyson and Cargill, and they need their.
I know, but there are people that are doing regenerative farming on an industrial scale.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there are some General GE has just announced they want to convert 1 million acres into regenerative organic. That's work in progress.
I'll send you a couple of references.
Okay.
Klaus, can you send a reference about what you just talked about?
About industrial agriculture and monocropping?
No, about somebody taking a large number of acres and turning it into regenerative.
I can't hear you.
I thought you said that somebody was taking a large number of acres and converting them into regenerative.
Right.
Can you send that for us, please?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Also, I don't want to seem to be anti-local production, but sometimes concerning like dairy farming, when you go to big dairies, you have less health problems or contamination in the dairy compared to some small local production. Okay, it's not always true that local production is safe. Okay. I don't know. This is also because somewhere we have local health requirements. We said sometimes, few times, let's say, it could be less safe to buy local compared to let's say a big dairy farm where you have or dairy production plant where you have ISO, where it's all is controlled, the pasteurization whatsoever. Sometimes I'm afraid to buy local for this reason, let's say, from a local dairy.
Bachara, did you finish the thought?
Yes.
So give me that concern in a short label. Say again?
It's not true that always local health requirements, we buy local for local health requirements, let's say. In local production, sometimes you can, it's not always safe sometimes to buy local, okay? Because of, when you have a big production plant, things are controlled. I take the example of a dairy plant. They have an excellent pasteurization. Sometimes the local farmer, they do things, or when they prepare food, not only when they grow, if they have some prepared food on their with their local production, sometimes it's not safe also.
Okay, so local production safety concerns would diminish local
Yes.
consumption. Is that what you meant?
Yes, this is it. Yes, okay.
Okay. All right. We have made my head hurt about as much as I can take today. Would encourage, implore, beg, whatever you want, go here. If you don't have access to this model so that you can work on it, let me know and I will give you access. Any one of these elements that you click on, we need some comments about what we think they mean, okay? And for any element of this model that you have a question about, you can click on the element and click here, and it will start a discussion thread about that particular element. So you can write or discuss or ask whatever questions you have about that particular element. And when you do, all right, if I started here, what are the major concerns? Create issue. Notice that now that element has an asterisk on it, so you know that there's an issue thread about this particular element. And if somebody else comes here, okay, it takes them to that sequence so that they can actually go ahead and read the comments that are there or add other ones to it. So in terms of updates, all right, what's this? Updates. Well, that didn't work. That's not right. Okay. If it doesn't get you there, which I thought it had been fixed, so it did. Well, that one did. Updates. There are a number of comments that have been made by Brian and I, and you can read them and add it to them so that we continue to fill out the background. When between now and the next session, which I'll schedule for Thursday, I will go through and update the arrows and move things around to see if I can make it a little bit more readable. And if I can find some additional loops, I will go ahead and add them to the sequence so that we can unfold them and change the order of unfolding in the future, as it makes sense. Questions, comments?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
So in the beginning,
I would like to. Yes, I would like to give some. I will comment on this. About this recent problem of the quality, because my background is engineering, and we are working also in the small. Are you able to hear actually? Okay, the sound is okay.
okay,
Hello.
yes, I'm listening.
Hello. I
You're
would like to give some comment about this. There are 3 points in food value addition, and in this, I think in the food and health, there are normal food items. There is organic food. One has to pay more than not that is without any control quality. Control. It is not organic one. So naturally, this way of thinking a better quality, give better value, that can be the motive to produce even in the milk. Even in the case of milk, we can use, integrated systems in which even, small birds like not chicken, but, ducks, they can control the nuisances, the diseases. This is proved. This is ecologically integrated systems. Such systems are our traditional. It is not a new one, actually. So, the quality issue, only the big can do, not small can do, is not correct, actually. So, it is depend upon the value addition. Actually. For example, I can give another example. There is one missing systems approach. Even in the education, because education, there is two parts. One is software, and is hardware. So in this education, we need to also put the education. We need to put the schools. The school is a system, actually. So they can work as a regenerative. For example, there is a need for resources input systems that has to be that needs to become through these schools, these education systems, to recover back the resources. This is as industrial engineering point of view, the resource recovery that can help to solve this problem. I fully agree. Brent's the concern about the cost and quality. I think I cannot talk much, actually, but the question and answer. So I think there is need for here the water resources, at least two input in the production system, the water and the organic residues, alternate to this the marketing systems. In the present retailer marketing system, in the world way, historically speaking, there used to be farmer trade fair everywhere, even in Brazil now. We have the direct systems. There is a need for us to urban and rural. Our system is rural, but that urban people can go back and then get directly. There need to be alternate direct, not through. They can decide what they want, and then they can help the farmers. So the local productions, so that it need to be the system that needs to be the next scenery. The insight maker, Jenny Berlinger given different way of the same structure, but one can add not a new systems, and one simplify the system. It's a simplified system, and put this as a next scenery, different sceneries. So one can get the picture. What is that? There is a need for the resource recovery. So I am introducing 2 points, resource input and resource recovery. That these are important. As far as actually, at least we can put two. One is water, and another is organic, the food from food residues. There is a need to be sustainable. Otherwise, the way the present big system, we remove the resources, so it is not sustainable.
Okay.
So presently it may work. In future it will not work. It is not work. And then we get degraded. We get degradation. There is no, all environmental problems come. One can see that actually the input of resources, there need to be much consideration. Is it clear?
Well, somewhat you're breaking up a little bit. Would you go ahead and write some of those thoughts in the comments here? Can you do that? Can you go ahead and send me your Kumu username? Pagandi, are you there? All right. I'll schedule another session for Thursday. See you then. Bye.
Bye.